Welcome back. We're now up to the elasticity, inelasticity chapter. And what we're talking about here is how the demand side of the equation works. We're not worried about the supply side yet. That's going to come later. So just focusing on demand, and what you've got in your textbook are 5 different boxes that represent different ways that demand actually happens from you and I, or from whatever source demand comes from. And so we're going to walk through this real quick. Now, the textbook spends a ton of time on the math of these equations. And frankly, I think many times the math just gets in the way of actually understanding what's really going on. But if you want to look at the math, and if you're taking more econ down the road, you're obviously going to have to spend some time on the math questions. So let's start with the first box that shows up in your textbook. This is the perfectly inelastic box. So we're talking about price going up this axis, and we're talking about quantity or time, whatever, going across this way. So it's going this way, it's going this way. So you'll notice that under the mythical demand, that what you've got is a line that goes straight up. Okay, so what does that reflect? That reflects that if the price is $1 for that product, how many are they going to sell? They're going to sell that many. If the price is $1,000 for that product, how many are they going to sell? That many. And there's a reason it's called mythical. Is there a great example of how this one works in the marketplace? There's not great examples, but I can give you some approximations of this one. Now, some of you might remember last year where there was this hedge fund guy who bought a pharmaceutical company. And the first thing he did is he raised the price of a particular drug 700%, 7,000%, I don't know, whatever it was. It was astonishing. He got called into Congress to defend himself on this. But he was basically saying, there are only a handful of people who need my drug, so what can I do? I can charge whatever I want. And so the notion is because there's only a handful of people that have a need for that product. Let me give you another example. Some of you might remember Denzel Washington did a movie a few years ago called John Q, where his son needed a heart transplant, and he was being denied, and so he holds the hospital hostage to do that. Well, the answer was that a mythical demand at some level? Probably. Fits in this category. So here's why it's called mythical. Because can you have this line continuing on into infinity? The answer is probably not. And so let me give you an example how this might work. So let's say one of my children has a very rare disease, and there's only one drug that helps. How much am I willing to pay so that my child has that drug? And the answer is, I'm probably willing to pay a lot for that drug. But wait a minute, isn't there a point where we say, can't do it anymore? I mean, I can't give up my house, I can't not take care of my other kids, I can't, So there are limits on how high this can go. Well, you would think that you would then sort of just cap this someplace. The answer is why I can't cap this someplace is because your decision making might be very different than mine, and you might be willing to go much higher or not as high or whatever, and so this is going to move around a bit, but I do think there tends to be a cap. So are there other examples besides pharmaceuticals for this one? Well, sure. In some parts of the world, water is becoming enormously expensive and scarce. And so how much are people willing to pay for water? Well, it could fit in this category. Probably not, but you can understand the dilemmas, and particularly if you've got a water source that's between 2 countries and they're both fighting over it and they both desperately need it. Or I suppose we could look at Las Vegas as an example. Here's the agricultural community in Las Vegas that has now lost their water supply to irrigate the crops, because where's the water going? Las Vegas for fountains and other stuff. Is that dumb? But it's the choice that we made for whatever reason. So this is going to happen. It's just not going to happen very often. Some have said diamonds will fit in this category. I don't believe it, because I think there's far too many diamonds in the world to ever get into this situation. But what you've got is De Beers, as an international company that restricts the flow of diamonds into the marketplace. For what purpose? Oh yeah, to keep the price high. Sure, of course. And so there are some examples of this one. The second one that we want to get to is something called relatively inelastic. Okay, so as the price goes up, what's going to happen? You're going to see some reduction in consumption, some, but it's not going to be huge. Okay, so let me give you an example of how this curve is going to work with price here again going up and then quantity going this direction. So if, for example, tomorrow the price of gasoline went to $6 a gallon, what would you do? The answer is you still got to drive around. You still got to get to work. You still got to do the stuff that you got to do and you need your car for. And so you're going to continue to consume gasoline even if it triples in price. What are you going to do then? Are you going to restrict some of your trips? You're going to restrict some of your opportunities to go just hang out someplace, whatever? And the answer is sure you will. Will you in fact become more wise in terms of one trip to do 6 things instead of taking one trip to do each one of those things? And so indeed, we're going to use some common sense to restrict the amount of consumption that we do. And so gasoline obviously fits in this category. We've got another category, which is called the sin tax, that fits very nicely into this box. And so, for example, you might remember that 25 years ago, you could go out and buy a pack of cigarettes for 50 cents. I don't think you're going to go anywhere in the country today and buy a pack of cigarettes for 50 cents. Is that because the cost of tobacco shot up? The cost of production shot up? No, it was because what did the government do? The government taxed the heck out of cigarettes. For what reason? Okay, 2 reasons. That's part of the nature of a sin tax. One is somebody dying of a tobacco-related illness, is that a cheap or an expensive process? And who's paying for it? And typically you're looking at Medicare, Medicaid, whatever. So in essence, excuse me, what does that mean? It means we're paying for it. And so one of the things you're doing is by raising the taxes on cigarettes is it's in essence a user's tax. And so it's recouping future costs that are going to be incurred somewhere along the way. So that's one reason, is that you want the person who's actually doing, quote, the harm to be paying the consequences of that. So externalities, is this an externality question? Sure it is. The other reason that you raise the price is think about the average 15-year-old. They can spend $7 for a pack of cigarettes, or in New York City, apparently it's 10 or 11, I don't know, whatever it is now. They could spend $7 for a pack of cigarettes. What else could they spend that $7 on? And that's opportunity cost. And so when you raise the price, what are you trying to say to young folks that have limited income? You don't want to spend your money here. You want to spend your money at the movies or whatever else it is you want to spend your money on. And so you're trying to discourage some consumption. And that's the nature of having prices go up on this one. So that one is a really important one. Do we see lots of examples of this relatively inelastic across our society? Absolutely, lots of examples of that. The third box is the standard box that we typically always see when we look at supply and demand. So as the price goes up, there's some corresponding reduction in the amount of consumption. As the price goes down, there's some corresponding increase in consumption. There's a ton of examples of how that one works. I'm not as interested in that one because it's fairly straightforward, fairly obvious. But let me jump over to this one. And this one was called relatively elastic. So relatively elastic. Okay, so the word elastic obviously means it moves up and down. Inelastic means it moves less. So relatively inelastic, let's say that you are going into Myers to buy some apples. And you walk into Myers and you discover that the apples that used to be 59 cents a pound are now $10 a pound. What are you going to do? And the answer is you're probably not going to buy apples, because one of the things you have here is something called substitutes. Okay, so if you're not going to buy apples, what can you buy? You can buy oranges, you can buy bananas, you can buy, all sorts of things, canned stuff. And so there's a ton of available substitutes. So what happens as the price goes up? What happens? Rather massive changes in the amount of consumption happen simply because there's lots of alternatives for us to look at. This is also where we look at the notion of advertising, branding, and the wonderful marketing notion of loyalty. And so what are you trying to do if you're a company? Aren't you trying to convince people that even though the price is going to go up, they should still pay the extra price because they're loyal to the brand? I don't know about you, but there's things that I'm loyal to. I'm loyal to Diet Pepsi. It's a joke in the family, but it is true. I am loyal to Diet Pepsi. I will pay a premium price for Diet Pepsi. Excuse me. Isn't there a cap someplace on that? Of course there is. There's a cap for me on that. Another one is Jif peanut butter. I am loyal to Jif peanut butter. The difference between generic peanut butter and Jif is, for me, substantial. And I will pay a premium price for that. And so relatively inelastic means as the price goes up and down, if we didn't have these things available, then you'd have a very different model of how this one would play out. All right, let me go to the fifth one. And the fifth one is called perfectly elastic. Okay, so you got a straight line going across here. And so the price stays the same. Quantity, and all over the place. How does this one work? This one is when there's only one buyer. So the buyer sets the price. So there could be hundreds, thousands of producers, but who's going to set the price? So the best example probably is the government. So in the agricultural system of a few years ago, you had price controls on agriculture, that the price of a bushel of corn or a gallon of milk or whatever couldn't fall below a certain price because the government didn't want farmers having to go in and out of business all the time. And the nature of agriculture is you really don't want farmers going in and out of business all the time. That industry doesn't lend itself to that kind of volatility. You and I would suffer enormously if we had that kind of volatility. So the idea is it's not as rare as this one, but it's relatively rare. There's actually another example of this that was actually comical for me. I heard a report a couple of years ago that in the cocaine industry, there is one buyer of cocaine in a particular region. That's the cartel. And so they say to farmers, we're going to pay you $400 a ton for your cocoa leaves, whatever they are. Does the farmer have any choice? Nope, they don't have any choice. Not at all. That's the way the system is going to work. So it doesn't matter how much they produce. It doesn't matter supply and demand. That's just the way the deal works. That $400 ton of leaves translates into how many hundreds of thousands of dollars when it hits the streets of New York City or wherever? And the answer is, yeah, obviously somebody's making a pile of money on that deal. But that is also part of what happens here. I give you other examples. I was in the Philippines as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I watched the government do this with coconut. The government bought up all the coconut from everybody in the country. And in those days, coconut was used as a preservative of food, and then we discovered saturated fat was bad, so suddenly that went away. And the other thing we used coconut for were beauty cosmetic products. And so the government bought up all the coconut. What happens to the price on the world market? It can get rather messy to look at some of the issues that show up in this one. And the sixth one that doesn't show up in your textbook is something that I refer to as a luxury curve. Okay, and you probably can think of some examples where as the price went up, unlike the models here where they say if the price goes up, what's going to happen? Consumption is going to go down. Well, in this box, price goes up and more people buy the product. Think about Air Jordans as an example. And Air Jordans, they could have priced those shoes at 25 bucks and still made a pile of money, but they charged 200 bucks for those shoes. So what was going on here? But why were people willing to spend $200 for Air Jordans? It's called psychology. And so the notion is, if I get those shoes, what can I now do? I can now be an NBA star. I can jump higher. I can go fast, whatever the deal is. But it actually has to do with some issues like prestige. So why does somebody buy a John Deere tractor rather than one of the red ones or blue ones or one of the other tractors? Because there's status connected to that. Cadillac was almost going out of business a few years ago. And Cadillac made the decision that the problem was they were pricing their car too low. They raised the price, and suddenly they were selling more again. It's very odd, but there are examples of how this works. And let me go one step further on this one, because this one's an important box for us in America today, and I'm irritated it hasn't showed up in the textbooks yet. But think about when you and I, there's a mall in Ann Arbor called Briarwood, and they got a place in there called Godiva's chocolates. So you can buy a little box of 4 chocolates for 12 bucks. You gotta be kidding me, 12 bucks for 4 pieces of chocolate? Pretty expensive. One of the things that's been happening in this last generation is you and I have bought into a different value system. And the value system is sometimes I deserve it. So I'm going to treat myself to something very, very nice. And so Godiva's, would they actually sell more if they lowered their price? Probably not. They probably would sell less. And there's lots of other examples of this. And so one of the things that I want to point out is that so many of the economic models assume that you and I simply want the cheapest price. And the answer is sometimes we don't. We've got a whole different value system that says sometimes we will appreciate quality, sometimes we will appreciate the brand, sometimes we'll appreciate a lot of different kinds of things. So understanding how you and I use demand with different products is important. Who else is it important to? How about the business community? Should the business community know which one they're most connected to? And isn't that going to constrain how they make decisions in the organization about pricing, but also quantity they're going to put onto the marketplace, and a whole bunch of other categories are going to start to show up. This is going to get us, next time we're going to be looking at the other piece of this, which is the supply side. So the chapter called Cost of Production comes next. See you then.